Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be exploring how we can apply Six Sigma and other continuous improvement tools to natural product manufacturing.
It's a really interesting area. You think about Six Sigma and you think about data and precision, and then you've got natural products, which are inherently variable. So how do those two worlds come together? That's what we're going to be looking at.
Yeah. And we've got research on everything from good manufacturing practices to case studies on specific psychedelic compounds. But it seems like the common thread here is really this drive for higher quality, higher consistency.
Absolutely.
So let's dive right in. For our listeners who might not be familiar with Six Sigma and Lean, can you give us a quick overview of what those methodologies are all about?
Sure. So they both have the aim of minimizing waste and maximizing value, but they come from it from slightly different angles. So Six Sigma really focuses on using data to reduce variation and defects in any process. And Lean, on the other hand, is all about streamlining processes, eliminating any steps that don't add value.
Okay, so they kind of work together almost, like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned data being a key element for Six Sigma. How does that actually play out in the real world? How is it used?
Well, this is where DMAIC comes in.
DMAIC.
DMAC. Define, measure, analyze, improve, control. So it's a 5-step process. It's a really good roadmap for tackling any kind of problem or any opportunity where you want to improve. So let's say you're a company, you're manufacturing cannabis extracts, and you're finding that the potency is inconsistent.
Okay.
So you're getting varying levels of THC in your extracts. So the first thing you would do is define what you're trying to achieve.
Okay.
So you might say, right, we want our THC levels to be within this very tight range. Then the measure phase is all about gathering data on your current process. So looking at what's happening at the moment, how much variation is there, where is that variation coming from?
You're getting a really clear picture of how the process is actually performing.
Yeah, exactly. And then you go into the analyze phase, which is all about understanding the root cause of those variations. So is it the extraction method that's causing the problem? Is it the raw material, the starting material? Is it the way you're storing it?
Oh, interesting.
So you really get to the bottom of what's causing that inconsistency. And then you go into improve, which is where you come up with solutions based on what you found in the analyze phase. So you might adjust the extraction process. You might look at different suppliers for your starting material. You might change the way you're storing things. And then the final stage, the control phase, is all about making sure that the improvements you've made are sustained over time. So you put systems in place to monitor everything. Make sure you don't slip back into the old ways of doing things.
Wow. It sounds very systematic.
Yeah.
Which I imagine is incredibly important when you're dealing with something as complex as pharmaceutical manufacturing.
Yeah.
We actually have one source that dives into the multi-step synthesis of citalopram, which is an antidepressant drug. What stood out to you about applying these quality principles in that kind of setting?
Yeah, so the citalopram synthesis is a really interesting example because it shows how even tiny variations in the process can have a big impact on the quality of the final drug product. So in particular, there's one step which converts an alcohol into something called a methane sulfonate.
Okay.
And this methane sulfonate is very reactive, which means it's prone to side reactions.
Okay.
And those side reactions can lead to impurities in the final product.
And those impurities could impact how safe and effective the drug is.
Absolutely. And so what they do is they use all sorts of controls in the process, really tightly controlled reaction conditions. They monitor things constantly. They use very sophisticated analytical techniques just to make sure that this one step stays on track.
It sounds like an incredible amount of attention to detail.
Yeah.
So they're really meticulously controlling things like the temperature and how long the reaction goes on for, making sure that the starting materials are very pure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good example of how these DMAIC principles can be applied in a very specific chemical context.
Now, a lot of our listeners are interested in things like cannabis and psilocybin extraction. And I know the therapeutic potential of these compounds is something that's being researched quite a bit these days. So how do these principles translate to those industries?
I think it's becoming more and more critical because we're seeing increasing regulation around these substances. And so manufacturers need to be able to demonstrate that they can produce these extracts that are safe, that are consistent from batch to batch, and that are efficacious.
Okay.
The same DMAIC principles apply, but you do have some particular challenges in those industries.
What kind of challenges?
Well, if you think about the starting material, for example, if you're using a cannabis plant as your starting material, that's going to be a lot more variable than using a defined chemical.
Right.
So the cannabis plant, depending on the strain, depending on how it was grown, even how it was harvested, is going to have all sorts of different variations in its chemical constituents. And that's going to carry through the whole process. So you need to be able to identify the critical points in the process and control those really carefully.
That makes sense. That leads us to another concept that is discussed quite a bit in the research, quality by design,
Yeah.
or QBD. How does that approach fit into this whole picture of continuous improvement?
So QBD is really about taking a proactive approach to quality. It's about building quality in from the very beginning rather than just testing for it at the end.
I see.
So it's about understanding how all the different variables in the process, from the raw materials to the equipment to the specific parameters that you use, how those impact the quality attributes of the final product.
Oh, okay. So it's almost like becoming fluent in the language of the process rather than just following a recipe.
That's a great way of putting it. Yeah, yeah.
And risk management frameworks, things like failure mode and effects analysis, FMEA, how do they play into this?
Yeah, so they're really important because they help manufacturers to identify potential failure points in the process.
Yeah.
And they assess the potential impact of those failures. And that allows them to prioritize areas where they need to improve and put strategies in place to mitigate those risks before they even become a problem.
So it's like building a safety net into the system.
Yeah, exactly. You're anticipating what could go wrong and you're putting safeguards in place to prevent it. And that's really important when you're in an industry like cannabis or psychedelics, where the regulatory landscape is changing all the time and consumer expectations are high.
It sounds like you need to be really forward-thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And by integrating this risk management into their quality systems, manufacturers can make sure that they're more adaptable and that they're more resilient in the face of all the challenges that they're facing. And, you know, it's not just about the bottom line when you're thinking about this. You're dealing with products that can impact people's health and well-being. So that commitment to quality is even more significant, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something we're seeing a lot with psychedelics and their potential as therapeutic agents.
Yeah.
We've got a source here that actually dives into MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. So how do these principles that we've been talking about apply when the product isn't just a chemical compound, it's the therapeutic experience itself?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And this is where I think this concept of set and setting is so important.
And setting.
Yeah. So set refers to the individual's mindset. So what are their intentions going into the experience? What are their expectations? What's their emotional state?
Right.
And setting is all about the physical environment that they're in, the presence of the therapist, the overall therapeutic container that holds the experience.
So it's this interplay
Yeah.
of factors.
Yeah.
And it sounds like all of them need to be carefully considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can apply the same kind of statistical rigor to set and setting as we can to a chemical process, for example. But the principles are still the same. It's about understanding and controlling the variables to the best of our ability. So, for example, therapists undergo extensive training to understand how to create a safe and supportive environment, how to guide people through what can sometimes be very challenging experiences, and how to help them integrate those experiences into their lives.
So it's about bringing that same intentionality, that attention to detail, even when the process involves human interaction.
Yeah. And it also applies to the MDMA itself. As we see these therapies moving closer to mainstream approval, manufacturers are having to apply the same standards to MDMA production as they would to any other pharmaceutical. So we're talking about controlling impurities, making sure the dosage is consistent, making sure it meets all the good manufacturing practice requirements.
Yeah, you wouldn't want variability in the compound itself to impact the therapeutic process.
Exactly. And I think it just highlights how these principles that we're talking about, they're relevant across a whole spectrum of applications, whether it's a chemical synthesis, a plant-based extraction, even a therapeutic context.
Speaking of plant-based extractions, we do have some sources here that talk about the specific challenges of ensuring quality when you're dealing with cannabis or psilocybin products.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of the hurdles that those industries face?
Well, I think the biggest one is probably the variability of the starting material. We talked about that earlier. If you're starting with a plant, that's going to be much more variable than if you're starting with a defined chemical. So you might have, different genetics, you might have different growing conditions, different harvesting times. All those things are going to impact the chemical constituents of the plant. And that makes it quite a challenge to produce extracts that are consistent and that are free from contaminants.
And that's particularly important given that these products are being used increasingly in medicinal contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where data comes in and analysis comes in. We're seeing more and more manufacturers using techniques like high-performance liquid chromatography, or HPLC, to measure very precisely the levels of different compounds in the extract. So
Huh?
things like THC, CBD, psilocybin, they can measure those very precisely. And they're also using statistical process control to track all the different metrics over time, identify trends, and make any adjustments just to make sure things are staying consistent.
So it's kind of adapting those same principles, but in a different context.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to see that level of sophistication being applied to these industries because the demand for these products is increasing all the time. And consumers want high quality products. They want standardized
It
products.
sounds like these quality-focused approaches are going to be key for those companies to succeed. Now, we've got a really interesting case study here. A company that actually used this DMAIC cycle that we were talking about earlier to improve the consistency of terpene profiles in their extracts. So terpenes, those aromatic compounds that give cannabis its unique scent and flavor, they're becoming more and more important, not just for recreational users, but also for people who are using cannabis medicinally. So what can we learn from this case study?
I think it's a really nice illustration of how you can take DMAIC and apply it in a real world setting. So this particular company, they were having problems with batch to batch variation in the terpene profiles of their extracts.
Okay.
And that was impacting the aroma, but also potentially it could be impacting the therapeutic effects.
Imagine if you're trying to build a brand, having that kind of inconsistency would be a real problem.
Yeah, definitely. So they went through the DMAIC process and they started off the defining the problem. So they wanted to reduce the variation in these specific terpenes, things like myrcene, limon, pine. They wanted to bring the variation down to within a certain range.
So it's very specific. It's measurable.
Yeah, very specific. And then they went into the measure phase where they collected data on the terpene profiles of all their extracts at different stages of the process. And they used gas chromatography, or GC, to do that.
So again, very sophisticated technique.
Yes, and they were able to get a really detailed picture of what was in each batch.
Wow.
And that data then fed into the analyze phase so they could start to look at what was causing this variation. So they looked at things like the starting material, different strains of cannabis have different terpene profiles. They looked at the extraction parameters, so things like temperature and pressure, that can also have an impact, and even the storage conditions. Because terpenes are quite volatile, they can degrade over time.
So it's real detective work. You're trying to figure out, okay, where are these variations coming from? What's causing them?
Yeah, exactly. And once they had a good understanding of that, they could then go into the improve phase. And this is where they started to experiment with different things. They tried different extraction methods. They adjusted the parameters, the temperature and pressure. They tightened up their controls on storage. And so they were using the data to inform those changes that they were making. And then the final stage, the control phase, was about putting systems in place to monitor all of that on an ongoing basis. So they were regularly monitoring the terpene profiles of their extracts. And if they saw any variations creeping back in, they could make adjustments straight away.
That's amazing. So they're not just solving the problem, they're actually building a more resilient process.
Yeah, absolutely. And they got some really good results from that. They were able to reduce the variations significantly.
That's great.
So they had a much more consistent product, which obviously is good for their customers. But they also found that their process was more efficient, that they were reducing waste because they weren't having to throw away batches that were out of spec.
Yeah. So it's good for the bottom line as well.
Yeah. And I think it's a really good example of how these quality-focused approaches can really benefit companies. And it's not just about compliance. It's about actually building a culture of excellence, and that's going to drive innovation, and it's going to create value.
Now, one thing that keeps coming up in our research is this idea of integrating quality principles with risk management. So how do those two work together?
Well, I think it's about taking a proactive approach to both quality and risk.
Okay.
So you're not just waiting for things to go wrong. You're actually trying to anticipate what could go wrong and put things in place to stop it from happening.
Right.
So we talked about things like failure mode and effects analysis. That's one tool that can be used. And it's really about identifying those potential failure points and then assessing, okay, if this goes wrong, what's the impact going to be? And that allows you to prioritize so you can say, right, these are the areas we really need to focus on. These are the areas where we need to put safeguards in place.
So you're building that safety net like we were talking about before.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in industries like cannabis and psychedelics, that's particularly important because, like we said, the regulations are evolving all the time. Consumer expectations are high. So you need to be able to anticipate what's coming down the line and make sure that your systems are robust enough to deal with it.
So it's about being adaptable and resilient as a company.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems like we've covered a lot of ground here, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of all the different ways these principles are being applied. What other interesting examples or insights stood out to you from the research?
Yeah, there's a lot. One area that I thought was really interesting was this whole focus on controlling mutagenic impurities.
Mutagenic impurities.
Yeah, so these are substances that can actually cause changes in DNA, which obviously has implications for things like cancer.
Oh.
So it's a big concern for any pharmaceutical product, but especially those that are intended for long-term use. And this applies to both synthetic APIs and natural product extracts as well.
So it's not just about the purity of the main ingredient. You've got to make sure the whole process doesn't introduce these harmful substances somehow.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a multifaceted approach. You need to be thinking about the starting materials that you use, the excipients. So those are the inactive ingredients that often go into formulations. You need to make sure that those aren't contaminated. And then really carefully control the conditions of every step in the process. So things like temperature, pH, even the purity of the water that you're using, all of these things can have an impact.
So it's about attention to detail at every stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And a good understanding of the chemistry involved is really important. There's one source here that actually goes into quite a bit of detail about the challenges of controlling N-nitrosamines in drug products.
And nitrosamines.
Yeah, these are a class of compounds that are known to be potent carcinogens. And the problem is they can sometimes form during the manufacturing process, even if they're not present in the original ingredients.
How does that even happen?
Well, it often comes down to these unintended chemical reactions that can happen. So, for example, amines, which are quite common functional groups in a lot of drug substances, they can react with nitrites. And nitrites might be present in, trace amounts in some of the excipients that you're using, or even in the water.
Wow. So it's like this hidden reaction happening that you wouldn't necessarily even know about.
Yeah, that's right.
It makes you realize how much we depend on the expertise of these manufacturers to kind of anticipate these problems and make sure that they don't occur.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's why regulatory agencies have such strict limits on the levels of these impurities that are allowed. And manufacturers are having to use all sorts of strategies to make sure that they meet those requirements. So things like carefully selecting excipients, controlling the pH of the process, controlling the water quality, and in some cases actually having specific steps to remove or inactivate any N-nitrosamines that do form.
That's fascinating. It's like this whole other level of detective work involved in pharmaceutical manufacturing now.
Yeah, it is. And it's constantly evolving. As we learn more about these processes, we're finding new things to be concerned about and new ways to control them.
Now, another tool that came up in the research was this idea of design of experiments, or DOE. Now, I'll be honest, that sounds a little bit intimidating, but can you explain what that is and how it's being used in a way that even I can understand?
Sure, I'll try my best. So DOE is basically a statistical method, and it allows you to systematically change different parameters in a process and then see what effect that has on the outcome. So it's a way of kind of experimenting in a very structured way to find the best conditions.
So rather than just changing one thing at a time and seeing what happens, it's a much more kind of strategic and data-driven approach.
Yeah, exactly. And it's particularly useful for those really complex processes where you've got lots of different factors that could be interacting.
Right.
So, things like drug synthesis or extracting botanical medicines. DOE allows you to kind of explore all of those different interactions and work out what combination of parameters is going to give you the best results.
Yeah, one of our sources actually mentioned something called response surface methodology as well. Is that related to DOE?
Yeah, it is. It's basically a way of visualizing the results of a DOE experiment.
Okay.
So you can imagine it like a map of the process, and the different contours on the map represent different levels of, whatever quality attribute you're interested in.
Okay.
And you can see how changing the different parameters kind of moves you around on that map.
So it's almost like having a GPS for quality optimization. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. And that allows you to not only find the best conditions, but also to see how sensitive the process is to changes in each parameter, so you can design a more robust process.
So these statistical tools are really becoming essential as we strive for these higher levels of precision and control.
Absolutely. And as we get more into these natural products, and especially as they're being used therapeutically, this kind of rigor is going to be really important to make sure that they're safe and effective.
It's incredible to think about all the different levels that this applies to. We've talked about everything from chemical synthesis to the gut microbiome to setting in psychedelic therapy. And it seems like it's all connected by this idea of quality and continuous improvement.
Yeah, it's all about trying to understand these complex systems better and then using that knowledge to make them work better for us, whether that's improving the quality of a medicine or improving the experience of a therapy.
Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this. It's been a fascinating conversation. And for our listeners who want to explore this in more detail, we've got some great resources in our show notes, so be sure to check those out. And remember, stay curious, keep exploring, and always look for quality information. Until next time, happy deep diving.